Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep into a new law passed in Karnataka, India.
Oh, this should be interesting.
It's called the Karnataka Medical Registration and Certain Other Law Amendment Act 2024.
Wow. 2024. That's
Pretty new.
yeah, very new.
We've got the official text right here.
Oh, excellent.
It's fascinating. It touches on everything from who can practice medicine to how the medical council works, and even the safety of healthcare workers.
It's pretty comprehensive.
Yeah, so whether you're in healthcare or just interested in legal developments, this deep dive is for you.
Absolutely. This act is a pretty big overhaul of existing laws,
Right.
like the Karnataka Medical Registration Act of 1961 and the 2009 Act on Violence Against Healthcare Workers.
And get this, it's published in both English and Kannada,
Interesting.
with the Kannada version being the official one.
Wow, didn't know that.
It's a good reminder of the importance of regional languages, even in legal matters.
For sure.
But before we jump into the changes, can you give us a quick overview of the existing laws that this new act amends?
Absolutely. The 1961 Act basically set up the Karnataka Medical Council,
Which is?
kind of like the gatekeeper for the medical profession in the state.
Ah,
They're responsible for registering doctors, making sure they meet certain
makes
standards,
sense.
and handling any disciplinary issues.
So pretty important.
Oh yeah, crucial role.
And then in 2009,
Right, there was growing concern about violence against healthcare workers.
unfortunately.
Yes, very much so. And so they brought in a separate law specifically to address that.
Okay, so this new 2024 Act builds on both of those.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's like they're taking these existing structures and giving them a serious upgrade.
Yeah, you could say that.
Let's start with the Medical Council.
Sure.
The amendments make some pretty significant changes to its composition and how members are chosen.
Like what?
Well, for example, there's a new requirement for the government to consider representation for women and other social groups when making nominations.
That's right. And I think it's a really important step toward making sure the council reflects the diversity of the medical community and the patients it serves.
I agree. And it's not just about who's on the council, but also when those elections happen.
Right.
Now they have to be completed 3 months before the current term ends.
Interesting.
What do you think the rationale is behind that change?
It could be to ensure a smoother transition of power,
Yeah,
and avoid any gaps in leadership,
that makes sense.
or maybe to minimize the influence of outgoing members on the elections themselves.
Oh, that's an interesting point.
Yeah.
And while we're on the topic of elections,
Mhm.
there's another interesting tweak. Nominated members can take part in meetings,
Okay.
but they don't actually get to vote.
So they have a voice, but not a deciding vote.
Exactly. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a subtle but important distinction, I think.
Yeah.
It allows for a wider range of perspectives to be heard,
Yeah.
but ultimately keeps the voting power in the hands of the elected members who have a direct mandate from the medical community.
It does make you wonder, though,
What's that?
how much weight those nominated voices will carry in discussions. Do you think they'll be seen as influential advisors or potentially sidelined?
That's a great question. It'd be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out in practice.
For sure.
On top of that, we've got term limits now.
Oh, yeah. 2 terms max for the president and vice president.
What kind of impact do you think that will have?
Well, term limits can definitely shake things up.
True.
They can bring in fresh perspectives and prevent any one person from holding power for too long. But,
it also depends on how those terms are structured.
right, like, are they consecutive?
Exactly. And can someone serve 2 terms, take a break, and then potentially come back?
Yeah, those details could make a big difference.
Absolutely.
It's like a game of chess, right? Every move has potential ripple effects.
I like that analogy.
So we've got a more diverse council, a potentially faster turnover of leadership. All of that suggests a real push to make the council more dynamic and responsive. But what does that mean for the average doctor or patient in Karnataka?
Well, that's where the other parts of this act come in.
Okay.
It's not just about restructuring the council.
Right.
It's about addressing some really pressing issues within the healthcare system itself.
You mean like tackling the problem of people practicing medicine without proper qualifications?
Exactly.
What we often call quackery. I
Right.
was surprised to see a whole section dedicated to that.
It's more common than people might think, and it can have serious consequences for patients' health and well-being.
Oh, absolutely.
The act makes it crystal clear that practicing medicine without being registered with the council is a no-go.
Good.
Plus, it gives the council more teeth to actually investigate and report these cases to the police.
That sounds like a pretty big shift.
It is.
Instead of just relying on complaints, the council is now taking a more proactive role in rooting out quackery.
Yeah.
But How do you think that will work on the ground?
Well,
Investigating these cases can be pretty tricky, right?
absolutely.
Mm.
It'll be interesting to see what kind of resources and manpower they dedicate to this effort.
Yeah.
The Act mentions that they'll be laying out specific procedures for these investigations in separate rules, so we'll have to wait and see how that plays out.
Okay, so we've got a revamped medical council and a crackdown on quackery.
So far.
What else is in store for the medical landscape in Karnataka?
Well, they're also bringing medical registration into the 21st century.
How so?
The Act requires all existing practitioners to get a new registration number from the National Medical Commission.
Ah, yes. Section 2.8.
You got it.
It seems like a one-time thing to align with national standards.
Right.
And these registrations are valid for 5 years.
That's right.
What do you think the larger implications of this are? Are we moving toward a unified national registry for doctors across India?
It certainly seems that way. And that could have huge implications.
Uh.
Imagine a central database that tracks doctors' qualifications, where they're practicing, maybe even patient feedback.
Wow.
It could be a powerful tool for workforce planning, quality control, even research.
Yeah, that would be incredible.
But it's always a but.
It also raises a whole bunch of questions about data security, privacy, and who has access to all that information.
It's a fascinating possibility, but definitely one that needs to be approached carefully.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got a more inclusive and dynamic medical council, a tougher stance on quackery,
Yes.
and a potential move toward a national registry.
Right?
It feels like Karnataka is really trying to modernize its healthcare system from the ground up.
And that's not all.
Oh,
They're also taking some major steps to address a problem that's been plaguing healthcare workers for years.
which is?
Violence and harassment.
Let's talk about that after a quick break.
Sounds good.
We were just talking about the Act's provisions on violence and harassment against healthcare workers.
Right?
It seems like they're taking a much stronger stance now. They definitely are. They've actually amended the 2009 Act on violence against healthcare workers.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to include much broader protections.
So it's not just about physical violence anymore.
Exactly.
Oh.
It's not just about physical violence anymore. They've introduced this whole new definition of intentional insult that goes beyond physical harm.
Right.
Exactly. Think about things like verbal abuse,
Wow.
humiliation on social media,
Yeah.
even someone recording you without your consent.
That's awful.
All of that is now considered an offense under this law.
So they're really trying to cover all the bases,
They are. It's a recognition that the damage isn't always physical,
right?
and the emotional toll can be just as significant.
And it's not just doctors and nurses who are protected.
I know.
The Act covers all employees working in medical institutions, from security guards to ambulance drivers. It's like they're saying that everyone who plays a role in patient care deserves to feel safe at work.
I think that's a really important point. They're recognizing that violence and harassment can affect anyone in a healthcare setting,
Right.
and they're trying to create a culture of safety and respect for everyone.
It sounds like a pretty big cultural shift.
It is, and it's not just empty words either.
Oh, they've actually put some teeth into it.
Yeah, they've actually laid out some pretty specific penalties for both physical violence and intentional insult,
Like what?
including imprisonment and hefty fines.
Wow, that definitely sends a message.
It does, that they're serious about this.
But beyond the penalties, the Act also talks about security measures that hospitals and clinics need to implement.
That's right. Things like deploying security personnel,
Yeah.
making sure there are CCTV cameras in place,
Makes sense.
even setting up alarm systems.
So they're really thinking about prevention as well.
They are. They're essentially giving the state government the power to set those standards
Right.
and make sure healthcare institutions are actually taking steps to protect their staff.
Okay, so it's a multi-layered approach. Preventing incidents, having clear consequences for offenders, and creating a safer environment overall. It makes you wonder, though.
What's that?
Were things really that bad that they needed such a drastic overhaul of the law?
That's a really good question. I mean, it probably varies from place to place, but the fact that they felt the need to strengthen these protections so dramatically suggests that it was a serious enough problem to warrant action.
It's sad that it's come to this.
It is, and I think it reflects a larger trend we're seeing globally.
Really?
Yeah, where there's growing recognition of the need to protect healthcare workers from violence and harassment.
I'm curious, from a legal perspective, what stands out to you the most in terms of how these cases will actually be handled?
Well, for one, they're really emphasizing the need for speedy trials.
Interesting.
Investigations have to be completed within 60 days,
Wow, that's fast.
and the whole trial has to be wrapped up within a year.
So no dragging things out for years and years.
That's the idea. That's a
Mm.
pretty tight time frame, especially compared to how long some legal proceedings can drag on.
Yeah, that seems intentionally designed to make sure justice isn't delayed.
I think so, and they've even designated specific courts to handle these offenses.
So it's like a specialized system just for these types of cases.
Exactly,
Oh,
which I imagine helps streamline the process as well.
absolutely. And there's one more detail that I found quite interesting
Oh,
and potentially even controversial.
okay, tell me more.
The act says that courts shouldn't insist on corroboration of evidence from victims or medical institution staff unless there are very specific reasons to doubt their testimony.
Mm,
Wait, so they're basically saying believe the victim unless there's a really strong reason not to.
that's how I interpret it.
Wow.
And it's a pretty big deal, I think. It reflects a growing awareness of the power dynamics that can exist in these situations and the difficulty victims can face in coming forward.
Yeah, it takes a lot of courage to speak out against something like that.
It does, and it seems like they're trying to create a more supportive environment where victims feel heard and believed.
So it's not just about punishing the offenders,
Yeah.
it's also about supporting the victims.
Exactly.
It's almost like a shift in the burden of proof.
Right.
Instead of putting the onus entirely on the victim to prove what happened, they're saying, let's start by believing them and then investigate further if needed.
It's a really interesting approach, and one that I imagine could spark some debate.
Oh, I think it definitely will. It raises questions about due process and the presumption of innocence for the accused.
For sure. Those are important legal principles.
But it also highlights the very real challenges victims often face when trying to get justice.
Absolutely. It's a delicate balance.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground with this act.
We have.
It's clearly a major shakeup of the medical landscape in Karnataka, touching on everything from the composition of the medical council to the day-to-day safety of healthcare workers.
Hmm.
But I'm curious, what's the bigger picture here? What does this mean for healthcare in India as a whole?
That's where things get really interesting. This act isn't just about making changes in Karnataka.
Oh.
It has the potential to ripple outward and influence healthcare policy and practices across India.
Wow. So Karnataka could be setting a trend.
It could even serve as a model for other states looking to address similar challenges.
Now, that's a thought-provoking idea. Imagine this becoming a blueprint for change across the country.
Yeah, it would be pretty remarkable. It would certainly make a statement about India's commitment to modernizing healthcare and prioritizing the well-being of healthcare workers.
But on a more practical level,
Mm-hmm.
what specific aspects of this act do you think would be most appealing to other states?
Well, the provisions on protecting healthcare workers would likely be very attractive.
Yeah, I can see that.
The expanded definition of intentional insult, the clear consequences for offenders, the emphasis on security measures, it's a pretty comprehensive package.
And what about the potential hurdles?
The challenge, though, would be in implementation. Actually making sure these measures are enforced and effective on the ground requires resources, training, and a real commitment to changing the culture within healthcare institutions.
It's like you can have the best laws in the world,
Right.
but if they're not properly enforced, they're just words on paper.
Exactly. And the same goes for the crackdown on quackery.
Right. The idea of having a more proactive approach to identifying and prosecuting those practicing medicine without qualifications is appealing,
Mm-hmm.
but it takes a lot of work.
It does. Investigations can be complex, gathering evidence can be tricky, and you need a system that can actually handle those cases efficiently.
So it's not just about having good intentions.
No, it's about having the resources and the infrastructure to make it happen,
And then there's the big one,
which is,
the potential move toward a national medical registry.
yes, that's a big one. The benefits of that are pretty clear, but the challenges are enormous.
Like what?
You're talking about coordinating data across multiple states, ensuring data privacy, dealing with interoperability issues between different systems,
Yeah, it sounds like a logistical nightmare.
and managing a database of millions of doctors.
It's a logistical and technological feat, to say the least.
It is. But I think the fact that Karnataka is even taking steps in this direction is significant. It shows a willingness to embrace technology and collaborate on a national level to improve healthcare for all Indians.
And that's what makes this act so fascinating. It's not just about tinkering with existing laws. It feels like a real effort to push the boundaries, to think bigger, and to potentially pave the way for a more modern and equitable healthcare system in India. But of course, no deep dive is complete without hearing from the people who are actually on the front lines.
Absolutely.
So we reached out to some healthcare professionals in Karnataka to get their firsthand perspectives on this new law and what it means for them.
That's a great idea. I'm really curious to hear what they have to say. After all, they're the ones who will be living with the consequences of these changes, both good and bad.
Exactly. So let's hear from them next.
We're joined now by Dr. Anjali Kumar, a general practitioner who's been practicing in Bangalore for over a decade. Dr. Kumar, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Welcome to the deep dive, Dr. Kumar.
Dr. Kumar, when you first heard about this new act, what were your initial thoughts?
Yeah, what jumped out at you as the most significant changes?
Well, to be honest, my first reaction was a bit of relief.
Oh,
The part about protecting healthcare workers
right.
really resonated with me. It's something that we've all been dealing with,
Yeah,
this rising tide of violence and harassment.
unfortunately.
It is, and it's really good to see that the government is finally taking it seriously.
You're referring to the expanded definition of intentional insult, right?
Yes, exactly.
Things like verbal abuse and online harassment now being explicitly included as offenses.
It acknowledges that the harm isn't always physical.
Words can hurt, and the emotional toll of those insults, those threats, it can be incredibly draining. So to see that recognized in the law, it felt like a validation of our experiences.
Dr. Kumar, do you think the security measures outlined in the Act, things like CCTV cameras and alarm systems, are enough to actually deter these incidents? Or are there other approaches that you think would be more effective?
I think those security measures are a good start, don't get me wrong,
Sure.
but they feel a bit like putting a bandage on a deeper wound.
How so?
The real problem is the mindset, the lack of respect for healthcare workers, the unrealistic expectations that some patients have. We need more than just cameras and alarms. We need a fundamental shift in how people perceive us and the challenges we face.
So it's about changing the culture, not just implementing security measures. What kind of steps do you think would be most effective in achieving that?
Public awareness campaigns can be really powerful. We need to educate people about what it's actually like to work in healthcare, the pressures we're under, the emotional toll it takes. Maybe even start in schools, teaching kids about empathy and respect for healthcare professionals.
That's a really interesting idea, starting young and instilling those values early on. Dr. Kumar, the Act also introduces some pretty significant changes to the Karnataka Medical Council, particularly in terms of representation. What are your thoughts on those changes?
I think it's a positive step. The medical profession is incredibly diverse, and it's important that the council reflects that diversity. Having more women, more representatives from different social groups, it can only lead to better decision-making, more inclusive policies that benefit everyone.
It's about making sure that the people making the rules actually represent the people who have to follow them.
Exactly.
Dr. Kumar, one of the things that stood out to us in the Act was the requirement for all existing practitioners to get a new registration number from the National Medical Commission.
Right, Section 2.8.
It seems like a step toward creating a national medical registry for all doctors in India. What are your thoughts on that? Both the potential benefits and the challenges.
I think it's a really ambitious goal, and if they can pull it off, it could have huge benefits. Imagine being able to track doctors' qualifications, where they're practicing, even patient feedback. It could improve transparency, help with workforce planning, make it easier for doctors to move between states. But the challenges are enormous. Data privacy would be a huge concern. You'd need a robust system to protect that information.
And just logistics of managing a database that size,
Right.
for a country as large and populous as India, it's mind-boggling.
It would be a massive undertaking, no doubt. But I think it's worth exploring. If it's done right, a national registry could be a game changer for healthcare in India.
Well, Dr. Kumar, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Sure.
It's been really valuable to get your perspective as someone who's on the front lines of healthcare in Karnataka.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Kumar.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive into the Karnataka Medical Registration and certain other Law Amendment Act 2024 has shed some light on this complex but important piece of legislation. It's a law that's attempting to address some really critical issues in healthcare, from the safety of healthcare workers to the fight against quackery to the potential for a more modern and unified medical registration system.
And while the long-term impact remains to be seen, it's clear that Karnataka is trying to be a leader in healthcare reform, setting a precedent that other states might follow.
As always, we encourage you to keep digging deeper, exploring these issues, and forming your own opinions. The world of healthcare is constantly evolving, and staying informed is more important than ever.
Until next time. Keep those brains engaged and keep diving deep.
Thanks for listening.